The first thing anyone noticed about the village was how quiet it was at sundown. A hush would settle over the crooked wooden homes, the creaking porches, the smoke curling out of thin chimneys. Chickens scratched at the dusty earth, and an old dog barked once or twice before lying back down, nose between its paws. Beyond the fence line, the mountains rose tall and dark, their peaks already fading into violet shadow. Folks said the mountain held secrets older than the village itself, secrets buried deeper than the roots of the tallest oak. And on that evening, those secrets seemed to stir again. The man walking into town did not belong to it, and everyone who saw him knew. He was broad, his beard wild, his coat worn from the weather of too many winters. They called men like him mountain men, wanderers who lived half wild among rivers and ridges, carrying with them the smell of pine and campfire. He had the look of someone who had walked farther than most dared to dream. And yet, on his arm clung a girl with eyes wide as the horizon, her hair tangled from the long road behind them. She was small, her shoes scuffed thin, her gaze darting between the homes as though searching for something she feared to find. The girl's question had been asked hours earlier, out on the mountain trail when the only sounds were the cry of a hawk and the steady crunch of boots on frozen earth. She had looked up at him, her voice barely more than a tremble. "Are you going to sell me like Papa?" The words cracked the man's chest open as if an axe had struck him. He had stopped cold, hand tightening on the leather strap of the pack across his shoulder. His breath had caught in his throat, and before he could stop it, tears had carved hot tracks down his weathered face. For a long moment he could not speak, the mountain wind carrying away whatever words he might have had. Now, as the pair stepped into the dim lantern light of the main street, the girl's question still echoed. Inside him, he felt the weight of it heavier than his rifle, heavier than the pack of pelts slung across his back. The townsfolk, curious and cautious, watched from porches and windows. Strangers were uncommon, and strangers with children even more so. A woman drawing water from the well paused, her hand frozen around the rope. A boy stopped sweeping outside. The blacksmith shop. Old men on the bench outside the general store shifted uncomfortably, whispering beneath their breath. The village had its own history of sorrow. Everyone remembered the families who had come west chasing promises and leaving only greatest behind. Men had bartered children like cattle when hunger got too sharp. Widows had taken in little ones left behind in wagons on the trail. So when they saw the mountain man with the girl, suspicion mingled with pity. No one yet knew what their story was, but everyone could feel it carried shadows. The man did not speak as he guided her toward the inn, his hand resting protectively on her shoulder. His heart was still raw from the question, and he feared if he opened his mouth, the whole street might hear the breaking of it. The girl looked around as though each doorway might hold the ghost of her past, her small hand clutching his sleeve. She did not cry. She had already done enough of that on the trail, and he had seen how each tear hardened into silence afterward. She had the look of someone who had learned too young not to expect answers. Inside the inn, the air smelled of stew and smoke. A fire popped in the hearth, and the innkeeper, a stout man with tired eyes, studied the pair with a long silence before nodding them toward a corner table. The girl sat close to the mountain man, her back straight, her eyes never leaving the door as if fearing someone might walk through it at any moment. When the stew was set before her, she stirred it carefully, though she ate with the hunger of someone who had gone too many nights without. The man could hardly swallow his food. His mind spun back to that trail, to the sound of her voice, to the memory of her father's last days. He had not meant to carry her this far, not at first. But when the time came and no one else had stepped forward, he could not leave her behind. And yet, he feared he was no better than the ones who had failed her. The mountains were hard, and men like him lived harder. He had little to offer beyond survival, and survival came at a cost. The night pressed in thick outside, the mountains looming dark beyond the window. In the village, lamps flickered one by one, doors latched, shutters drawn against the wind. Yet in that small inn, the silence between the girl and the mountain man grew heavier than the storm clouds gathering over the peaks. She had not repeated her question, but it hung in the air all the same, every glance of her eyes a reminder of the answer he had not given. Somewhere outside, a dog barked again, sharp and warning. Hooves clattered on the frozen road, the sound of riders arriving late. The innkeeper stiffened, setting down the rag in his hand. The girl's spoon stilled mid-air. The mountain man's hand instinctively went to the rifle leaning against his chair. The door creaked as the wind pushed it open a fraction, the lantern light spilling into the night. The girl leaned close, her whisper barely heard above the crackle of the fire. "Is it them?" The man swallowed hard, his heart pounding like a drum in his chest. He did not answer. He could not. His eyes fixed on the shadow stretching across the doorway, growing longer with each step that neared the threshold. And in that moment, the question she had asked him on the trail seemed not only about the past, but about the night unfolding before them, whether he would stand for her, or whether the world would once again take everything she had left. The door swung wide. The door groaned against the wind as it swung open, and the lamplight spilled out into the cold street. A figure stepped in, brushing snow from his coat, boots clattering heavy on the wooden floor. He was not alone. Two more men followed close behind, their faces shadowed under wide-brimmed hats. The smell of horses and damp leather clung to them, and the way the room felt quiet told the mountain man that these strangers were not welcome here. The innkeeper stood still behind the counter, his jaw set, his eyes flicking nervously toward the girl. The mountain man's hand hovered near his rifle, though he did not yet take it up. He had known men like these before. Riders who came into towns after dark rarely carried good news. Their steps were too sure, their voices too quiet as they muttered between themselves. They took a table near the door, giving the room a full view of their backs, a position chosen by men who wanted no one creeping up behind them. The girl leaned closer to him, her small fingers clutching his sleeve until her knuckles whitened. He could feel the tremble in her hand, and the weight of her earlier words pressed down on him again. The strangers ordered ale, their voices low, gravelly. One of them pulled a folded paper from his coat and laid it flat on the table. Though the light was dim, the mountain man caught sight of the inked lines, the sharp letters that looked too official for comfort. He turned his gaze away, but the girl had already seen. Her eyes went wide, and her breath caught in her throat. She knew that paper, or at least she feared she did. The innkeeper busied himself with the mugs, but his movements were stiff, careful. Around the room, the few villagers who had come for supper found reasons to leave. Chairs scraped back against the floor, boots shuffled toward the door. Within minutes, the only ones left were the strangers, the innkeeper, the mountain man, and the girl. The fire hissed in the silence, the crackle loud enough to echo. He wished he could take her away right then, back to the road, back into the safety of the mountains, where shadows belonged to trees and not men. But the storm outside had already begun to sweep across the valley. Snow thickened against the window, and the howl of the wind carried through every crack in the inn's walls. There would be no leaving tonight. They were trapped between the storm outside and the strangers within. The girl lowered her voice to a whisper, her words quivering. "They're looking for me, aren't they?" Her eyes stayed fixed on the paper across the room, though her face turned pale. The mountain man did not answer right away. He felt the truth lodge in his chest, sharp as a splinter. He knew enough to recognize the way the riders carried themselves. They were trackers, hired men, the kind who followed trails. Until they ended, his silence was answer enough for her. She pressed closer to him, her small frame shaking though she tried to hide it. "You promised you wouldn't leave me," she whispered again, and her voice cracked on the word promised. He thought of the day her father had fallen sick, the fever burning him hollow in the cabin by the river. He thought of the girl sitting beside the bed, holding her father's hand until the last breath slipped away. There had been no family to turn to, no one else to carry her forward. Just him, the man who had hunted with her father, traded with him, shared fire and silence under the stars. He had not promised her then. He had only taken her hand and led her away from the grave. But now, under the glow of lantern light and the eyes of the strangers, he realized that his silence had already become a promise in her heart. The writers spoke in low tones, though sometimes a word carried across the room, reward, missing, girl. Each word struck him like a blow. He lifted his cup, but the stew had turned to ash in his mouth. The girl watched him with wide, pleading eyes, waiting for him to tell her it wasn't so, waiting for him to promise again that he would never hand her over. But his throat felt raw, his voice stuck behind the weight of choices he had yet to make. The storm outside beat harder, rattling the windows. Snow hissed against the glass, the world beyond vanishing in a blur of white. The mountain man knew the riders would not leave come morning, not until they had found what they were sent. For. And in the quiet of the inn, he could feel their gazes shift toward him and the girl, studying, measuring, waiting for a slip of truth to show itself. He guided her to their room with a steady hand, though inside he shook as much as she did. Narrow stair creaked under their weight, and the hall smelled of pine boards and cold air. Their room was small, a single bed against the wall, a cracked basin on the stand, and a window that looked out into the swirling snow. He sat on the edge of the bed, his rifle leaning within reach, the firelight from the hall spilling thin across. The floor. The girl crawled beneath the quilt, but she did not close her eyes. She stared at him, waiting, her small voice finally breaking the silence. "Why did they want me?" He lowered his head, the words bitter as they formed. "Because men are cruel, little one. Because some see what they can take and never what they can give." He stopped himself before saying more, but the look in her eyes told him she already understood more than she should. He thought back to her father's land, the patch of ground near the river, rich with timber and game. He remembered the men who had come asking, pressing him to sell, and the way he had refused. He remembered how quickly sickness had followed, how suddenly the fever had taken him. Perhaps it had been chance. Perhaps it had not. And now, the girl was the last link to that claim. The mountain man clenched his fists. He had lived most of his life without ties, without chains, roaming where the rivers led. But now, with the girl's voice echoing in his ears, he felt bound. Tighter than ever before. He could not trade her away. He could not leave her. Yet he knew that men with papers and silver tongues often carried more power than bullets. The storm deepened through the night, and though the girl's eyes finally closed, his never did. He sat in the chair, rifle across his knees, listening to the wind scream through the cracks. From below came the muffled voices of the riders, their laughter sharp, their boots striking against the boards. He knew they would wait for morning, for daylight to give them clearer sight. And when the storm passed, they would begin their search. In earnest. Just before dawn, when the sky outside still burned black and the snow had quieted, he rose and went to the window. The world lay buried under white, the mountains hidden, the trail erased. It was both a curse and a blessing. Tracks could no longer be read, but neither could escape be easy. He placed a hand against the cold glass, the frost biting his skin, and he swore to himself in silence that he would not let the girl's question come true. He would not be the one to sell her, not to anyone, not for any promise of silver or land. But as the first pale light crept through the storm, he heard the sound of boots climbing the stairs. Slow, deliberate, one step, then another. Each creak louder than the last. The girl stirred under the quilt, her eyes fluttering open. She looked at him with fear already brimming, her voice a whisper. "Are they coming for me?" He gripped the rifle tight, his jaw set. He did not answer. The footsteps stopped outside their door. Silence pressed in heavy. A hand rapped once, sharp against the wood, and the mountain man knew that whatever choice he made next would decide not just the girl's fate, but his own. The knock on the door hung in the air like thunder before a storm. The mountain man's hand tightened on the rifle, his breath slow but unsteady. The girl sat up, clutching the quilt to her chest, her wide eyes fixed on the wood that separated them from whatever waited outside. The rapping came again, sharper this time, and a voice followed, calm, low, but carrying the weight of authority. "Evenin'. Sorry to disturb. We need a word." The mountain man did not move. He studied the door, the iron latch that looked far too thin against danger. His mind churned with every choice, each one leading to a road he could not yet see the end of. He thought of lifting the rifle, of firing through the wood, but the girl's presence stilled him. He thought of opening the door, pretending ignorance, but the weight of the voice outside told him these men already knew too much. The girl whispered, "Don't let them in." Her voice cracked, yet it carried more strength than her small frame. Should have held. Boots shifted in the hallway, more than one set. The men were patient, not forcing the latch, not breaking it down. That patience unnerved him most of all. It meant they believed time was theirs to command. After a moment, the footsteps faded back down the stairs, leaving only silence behind. The mountain man waited long after, listening. Only when the inn settled back into the creaks of wood and the hush of snow did he lower the rifle. The girl's eyes searched his face, begging for reassurance, but he could give none. He only said, "Sleep if you can. Tomorrow will bring more than either of us wants." Neither of them slept. When dawn came, the storm had laid a white blanket over the town. The mountains loomed hidden, their jagged edges softened into clouds of snow. Smoke rose from chimneys, and the village stirred with the weariness of people who knew life's weight too well. The riders were already outside, their horses pawing at the frozen ground, their faces shadowed under wide hats. The mountain man and the girl slipped out of the inn quietly, their steps muffled in the snow. He kept his head low, his beard drawn into his collar, but even so he could feel the eyes on them. The townsfolk glanced up as they passed, some with pity, some with warning. No one spoke. Silence was safer when men with papers and guns rode. Through the streets, they walked toward the blacksmith shop where a man he trusted worked his forge. Smoke hissed up into the gray morning as the hammer struck iron. The blacksmith looked up when they entered, his brow furrowing at the sight of them. He wiped his hands on his apron and shut the door tight before speaking. "You've brought trouble with you?" His voice was not harsh, but it carried the truth plain as steel. The mountain man nodded once. "I need supplies, rope, powder, what you can spare." The blacksmith's gaze flicked to the girl, who stood half-hidden behind the mountain man's coat. "And her?" he asked softly. "She stays with me," the mountain man replied, his tone leaving no space for argument. The blacksmith studied him for a long moment, then sighed and gathered what little he could. He packed powder in a pouch, handed over a length of sturdy rope, and set a skin of water on the bench. "The riders asked after you already. They say there's a paper, signed and stamped. Claim the girl belongs to another family downriver." The girl shook her head fiercely, her small fists clenching. "That's not true," she said, her voice trembling but steady. "Papa said never to trust men with papers." The blacksmith's eyes softened, but his face remained grim. Truth don't always matter to men with guns and seals. Be careful. With the supplies tucked away, the mountain man led her back into the biting air. He could feel the riders' gazes following, though none moved against him yet. They were waiting, like wolves circling, confident their prey could not outrun them. That evening, in the narrow room of the inn, he began to plan. The storm had left drifts high on the mountain trails, but he knew paths no tracker would easily find. He thought of the river, frozen at the edges, running swift beneath. He thought of the caves, the hidden valleys where smoke could vanish among the pines. Yet each thought circled back to the same truth: men with enough will and silver could hunt forever. The girl sat at the edge of the bed, her eyes far away. She asked quietly, "Why me? Why won't they leave me alone?" He hesitated before answering. "Because you carry something they want. Not gold, not land. Something else." He paused, searching for words that would not break her. "Your father was a man who stood against them. You're his blood. That makes you more powerful than they like." Her brow furrowed, confusion mixed with fear. "But I'm just a girl." He shook his head slowly. "That's what they don't understand." The night passed heavy. Outside, the riders drank and laughed in the tavern, their voices drifting through the cold. Inside, the mountain man sharpened his knife in silence, the rasp of steel against stone filling the room. By morning, a new face arrived in the village. A woman, cloaked and hooded, rode in with the storm's tail at her back. She carried no weapon in sight, only a satchel slung across her shoulder. The riders greeted her with nods, though she did not linger with them long. She made her way to the inn, her boots soft on the snow. When she entered, her eyes fell immediately on the girl. The mountain man felt his blood chill. He rose, his hand hovering near his rifle, but the woman raised a hand slowly, peace in her gesture. "I mean no harm," she said, her voice calm, almost gentle. "I've come for the child." The girl stepped back, pressing against the mountain man's side. "I don't know you," she whispered. The woman's gaze softened. "No, but I knew your mother. Before the sickness. Before the trail took her." The words hit like a stone dropped in a still pond, sending ripples through the mountain man's thoughts. He had never heard the girl's mother spoken of, not by her father, not by anyone. The girl's eyes widened, tears welling. "You knew her?" The woman nodded, but there was sorrow in her face. "I knew her, and I know what these men want. They'll twist the truth to take you. You mustn't let them." The mountain man studied her, suspicion etched deep in his eyes. "And why should we trust you?" She met his gaze without flinching. "Because I was once hunted too." The girl looked between them, her small hands trembling. The mountain man felt the ground shift beneath him, the conflict deepening in ways he had not foreseen. Now it was not only riders and papers, but memories, blood ties, and secrets buried in the past. The girl's question echoed again in his mind, "Are you going to sell me like Papa?" And with each passing hour, the choice grew heavier. That night, as the village settled into uneasy silence, the woman's words lingered. The riders remained outside, their campfires glowing red in the snow. The innkeeper kept his doors barred, fear pressing down on every soul in town. The mountain man sat by the window, rifle across his lap, the girl asleep at last beside the quilt. He watched the shadows of the riders moving in the firelight, circling, waiting, and in the darkness of that room he realized the true fight had only begun. It was not just against the riders, nor the papers they carried. It was against the web of lies and power that stretched far beyond the village, reaching into the past, threatening the future. The girl stirred in her sleep, whispering broken words he could not catch. He reached out, resting his rough hand over hers, and swore silently that he would not let her face the fate others planned for her. Yet he knew the storm gathering outside was larger than the one that had buried the valley in snow. The knock that came later that night was softer than before, almost polite, but it carried the same weight. The woman's voice followed through the door. "They will move at dawn. If you wish to keep her safe, you must decide before the sun rises." The mountain man sat in silence, staring at the flame of the candle as it wavered in the draft. The choice pressed harder than ever. To run into the mountains meant hunger, cold, and endless pursuit. To stay meant chains written in ink and sealed with lies. The girl shifted again, her hand clutching his. He looked at her small face, half lit by the candle's glow, and knew there was no easy path ahead. Outside, the riders laughed by their fire, certain that morning would bring them victory. Inside, the mountain man's heart pounded with a single truth: whatever happened next would change everything. The candlelight burned low, throwing restless shadows against the walls. The mountain man sat rigid in his chair, the rifle across his knees, the woman's warning still echoing in his ears. They will move at dawn. The girl slept uneasily beside him, her breath uneven, her small hand clutching the quilt like a lifeline. Each creak of the inn's timbers, each gust of wind against the shutters, pulled his nerves tighter. He had known storms, he had known hunger and danger, but this was different. This was a noose tightening slowly, and every moment that passed brought it closer to snapping. When the gray of morning finally seeped into the sky, the inn felt colder, more hollow. Outside, the riders stirred, their boots striking against the frozen earth, their horses snorting clouds into the air. The mountain man rose and laid a hand on the girl's shoulder. She woke quickly, her eyes already wide, as if she had been waiting for his touch to break the fragile veil of sleep. "It's time," he said softly. She nodded, silent, already pulling her shoes on with trembling hands. The woman waited in the hall, her hood drawn low, her satchel slung across her side. She said nothing as he led the girl out, but her eyes carried an urgency that words could not match. Together, the three slipped out a back door into the biting air. Snow crunched beneath their boots as they cut through alleys and back lanes. Smoke drifted above the rooftops, and the village seemed to hold its breath, aware of what hunted in its streets. The mountain man kept his head down, guiding the girl close against him, but he knew every window concealed eyes, every doorway a silent witness. By the time they reached the edge of the village, he could hear the riders behind them, voices sharp, commands barked, boots striking hard against the boards. The woman pointed toward the tree line where the forest began its climb up the lower slopes. "This way," she whispered. "They won't expect us to take the steep path." The mountain man hesitated. The trail she meant was treacherous, narrow, and slick with snow, a place where one wrong step could send them tumbling into the gorge. But the sound of horses bridling behind them made the choice for him. He gripped the girl's hand and followed. Climb was slow, every breath burning, every muscle straining. Snow fell from branches above, clumps thudding onto their shoulders. The girl stumbled more than once, her small legs trembling, but she held fast to his coat, never letting go. The woman moved ahead with surprising surety, her steps light as though she had walked this way before. Behind them came the unmistakable sound of pursuit men shouting, dogs baying, hooves clattering on the frozen road. The mountain man pushed harder, his heart pounding, the rifle shifting against his back. Each step seemed to echo the girl's question, the one that had broken him on the trail. "Are you going to sell me like Papa?" The words haunted him, and with every glance over his shoulder at the riders gaining ground, he swore silently that he would not let her fall into their hands. By midday, the storm began to return. Snow thickened in the air, swallowing the world into a blur of white. The forest grew dense, branches heavy with ice, the path narrowing until it was barely a strip of frozen earth against the gorge. The girl clung to him, her face pale from cold, her lips pressed tight to keep from crying out. The woman stopped at a bend, pointing toward a cleft in the rock. "There," she said. "We can shelter for a while." They ducked into the hollow, the cold stone pressing against their backs, the snow drifting past the opening. The girl curled into the mountain man's arms, her small body shivering. He wrapped his coat around her, pulling her close, the steady beat of his heart the only warmth he had left to give. The woman crouched near the entrance, her eyes scanning the whiteness beyond. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "They'll come fast now. The storm will cover our tracks if we can hold them off long enough." The mountain man studied her, suspicion still coiled tight in his chest. "Why are you helping us? What do you gain?" Her gaze flicked toward the girl, then back to him. "Because I know what it means to be hunted, and because her mother once saved me when no one else would." The girl stirred at the words, lifting her head. "You knew Mama," she whispered. Again, as if the thought was the only fire left inside her, the woman nodded, sorrow shadowing her face. "She was braver than most men I've ever known. And now they want to take you because of her." The girl pressed her face into the mountain man's chest, her small voice muffled but clear. "I don't want them to take me." "They won't," he said, though the weight of the promise nearly crushed him. Not long after, the baying of dogs rose through the storm. The sound carried across the gorge, closer now, sharper. Men's voices followed, harsh commands cutting through the wind. The mountain man tightened his grip on the rifle, his jaw set. The woman's hand went to her satchel, pulling free a small pistol, its metal worn but steady in her grip. The snow blurred everything, but shadows moved beyond the hollow, dark forms, pressing through the trees. The girl clung tighter, her small body trembling with fear. The mountain man pressed a rough hand against her hair, his heart pounding like a drum. He had lived his life running from bonds, fleeing from towns and promises, but now he knew there was no more running left. The fight was coming, whether he wanted it or not. A rider's voice rang out clear, closer than he expected. "Come out now, and no harm will come to the child." The lie in the words was sharp as a knife. The mountain man's teeth clenched. He shifted, peering through the snow. He could see them now, dark figures fanning out, rifles slung, dogs straining against their leashes. They moved with the certainty of men who believed they already owned what they hunted. The woman's voice cut low. "If they breach the hollow, we'll be trapped." He nodded, his mind racing. He thought of the trail that curved above them, narrow but hidden, a path only. He might know. If they could reach it, they might buy more time. But moving meant risk, and the riders were closing in fast. The girl whispered again, her voice tight with fear. "Will they hurt you?" He looked down at her, his rough hand brushing her cheek. "Not if I can help it." The storm howled, swallowing the world in white. The dogs barked louder, men shouted commands, boots crunching through snow. The hollow shook with the sound of pursuit. The mountain man lifted his rifle, his breath steady now, his eyes hard. The woman raised her pistol beside him, her jaw set. The girl buried her face against his chest, her small fingers clutching the leather of his coat. The first shadow appeared at the edge of the hollow, a man's shape blurred by snow, his rifle lifted. The mountain man's finger tightened on the trigger. The air was thick with the weight of what was about to happen. The line between survival and ruin as thin as the breath between heartbeats. He knew there was no turning back. The riders wanted the girl, the papers in their hands claiming her as if she were nothing but property. But she was flesh and blood, a child who had already lost too much. He would not let her question become truth. He would not be the man who gave her away. Snow swirled, the storm roaring, the shadows pressing closer. The hollow shook with the thunder of pursuit, the world narrowing to a single point where choice and consequence collided. The mountain man's heart pounded, his breath steadying into silence, and just as the first rider's boot crossed the threshold, the girl whispered the words that cut deeper than any bullet. "Don't let them take me." The trigger trembled. Under his finger, the first shot cracked like thunder in the hollow, echoing against stone and snow. The mountain man's rifle bucked against his shoulder, and the rider at the mouth of the cave fell backward into the storm. The dogs howled, men shouted, boots pounded as they rushed closer. Smoke curled from the barrel of the rifle, hot against the freezing air, but he felt no triumph, only the weight of survival pressing harder than ever. The girl screamed and clung tighter to his coat, burying her face as if she could hide from the sound of war. The woman crouched low beside him, pistol steady, her eyes sharp as flint. She fired once, twice, the flash of the muzzle cutting through the storm, forcing the riders back into the swirling white. The world outside dissolved into chaos. Shouts carried through the snow, dogs pulling hard at their chains, men scrambling to regroup. The mountain man knew they would not retreat easily. These were hired men, and hired men did not return empty-handed. "We can't stay here," the woman hissed. "They'll surround us," he nodded. His mind raced, weighing paths and risks. The narrow trail above the gorge, hidden by pine and snow, that was their only chance. He pulled the girl to her feet, steadying her trembling legs. "Hold on to me," he said, his voice low but firm. She nodded, eyes wide with fear but filled with trust, and clutched his coat tighter than ever. Together they scrambled up the rock face, boots slipping, hands raw from cold stone. The woman climbed ahead, her cloak catching on branches, her breath ragged in the freezing air. Below them, the riders cursed and fired blindly into the storm, bullets hissing past like angry bees. The mountain man shielded the girl with his body, his heart pounding as stone chipped near his head. But step by step, they climbed higher until the hollow was lost below, swallowed by the storm dot. When they reached the narrow trail, the forest closed around them, thick with snow and silence. The storm, fierce as it was, became a cloak now, hiding their movement. The mountain man paused to catch his breath, his chest burning, his hands shaking not from the cold but from the weight of what nearly was. The girl pressed against him, her face pale, her small voice breaking the quiet. "You didn't let them take me." He looked at her, his throat tightening, his rough hand brushing the snow from her hair. "No," he said, his voice steady, "and I never will." The woman's eyes softened, though sorrow still lingered in their depths. "They won't give up easily," she said, "but we've bought time. And sometimes time is the only victory we get." They pressed deeper into the forest, winding along the hidden paths the mountain man had known since youth. Hours passed, the storm covering their trail, muffling the sound of pursuit. By nightfall, they reached a cave tucked beneath a granite outcrop, sheltered from the wind. There they built a small fire, its glow flickering against the stone walls. The girl sat close to the flames, her small hands outstretched, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. She leaned against the mountain man's side, the rise and fall of his chest lulling her toward sleep. For the first time in days, her face looked peaceful. The woman sat across from them, silent, her gaze fixed on the flames. At last, she spoke. "Her mother saved me once. Years ago, when I was no older than she is now. I was running too, hunted for debts I couldn't pay, and she gave me food, shelter, and a chance to keep going. She told me no one deserved to be sold away, no matter what the papers said." Her voice faltered, and she looked at the girl with quiet pain. "That's why I came, to repay what I owe." The mountain man studied her, the firelight flickering across his worn face. He had not trusted her at first, but her words carried the weight of truth. And in the girl's eyes, he saw something stir hope, faint but real. For days they moved through the wilderness, staying off the roads, following. Hidden streams and ridges where no horse could pass. The riders searched, but the storm had stolen their tracks, and the mountains kept their secrets. Slowly, the sounds of pursuit faded, replaced by the steady rhythm of wind and water. One evening, as they camped beside a frozen creek, the girl asked the question that had lingered in her eyes since the beginning. Why do they want me so much? I'm just a girl. I don't have anything. The mountain man crouched beside her, his rough hand resting gently on her shoulder. You have more than you know. Your father stood for his land, for his home, when others tried to take it. That made him a target. And you carry his name, his blood. To men like them, that makes you something they can own, something they can claim. She looked up at him, her eyes shining in the firelight. What am I then? He smiled, weary but true. You're free. And no paper, no seal, no man with a gun can take that from you. The woman nodded across the fire, her face solemn. Your mother believed the same. She gave her life for it. And now it's ours to protect for you. The girl pressed closer. To him, her small voice whispering, Then don't let me go. His arm tightened around her, and his voice broke into a whisper. Never. The days turned into weeks. The mountains became their shield, the snow their cloak. Slowly, the fear that had pressed on every breath began to ease. The riders did not return. The dogs fell silent. The world narrowed again to the sound of wind in the trees, the crackle of fire at night, the steady rhythm of footsteps on frozen ground. In time, they found a place where the river bent around, a clearing where pines grew thick and the land offered shelter. There they built a cabin, rough but strong, its walls rising from sweat and will. The girl carried wood, laughing sometimes when the logs tumbled, her laughter ringing like a bell that cut through the long silence of grief. The mountain man worked with steady hands, carving each beam, each stone, as if he was shaping not just a home but a promise. The woman stayed too, her shadow no longer burdened with flight, her eyes finding peace in the smoke that curled upward. Each evening. One night, as the fire burned low, the girl sat between them, her face bright in the glow. Are they gone forever? She asked. The mountain man met her gaze, the memory of the riders still sharp in his mind. Men like that never vanish, he said softly. But they'll not take you, not while I still breathe. The girl leaned against him, her trust complete. And in that moment, he knew the question that had haunted him from the beginning was answered. He would never sell her, never leave her, never let her face the world alone. Years later, when the cabin had grown into a homestead, when the girl had grown taller, stronger, and carried the same fire her parents once held, the memory of that winter lingered. The storm, the riders, the hollow all became stories told by the fire. Stories of fear, but also of courage. And when the girl asked again, not in fear this time but in curiosity, why didn't you give me up when it would have been easier? The mountain man smiled, the lines on his face deepened by years but softened by love. Because you weren't something to give, he said. You were someone to keep. The girl smiled, her eyes shining, and the firelight flickered across them both, carrying the warmth of a promise kept through snow, storm, and sorrow. The mountains stood silent around them, eternal and unyielding, as the wind whispered through the pines. And in that quiet, the story of a question and its answer came to rest, not with tears but with peace.